Good afternoon. I'm Richard Seeline. I'm the managing partner of the Roar Partnership and the co-founder of the Resilience Innovation Hub based here in Houston. I am so pumped to finally get the Resilience Innovation Investor Forum kicked off and launched. As many of you are aware, and those who are not, we were going to do this in October, November, December, and January. And as we are all dealing with a new reality that's been in place for 2.5, close to 3 years, Omicron did not afford us an opportunity to convene in person. So we decided that we were not going to reschedule, but go to a very interesting hybrid format, and that is break the forum apart rather than having individuals such as you all and others sit for 6 hours back to back for 2 days. You'll hear about how we're going to deliver the forum in a little bit, but I wanted to thank you all for your patience in partnership and where we are now headed for February through April. I believe is an exciting approach. Although you cannot replace, obviously, being in person, which we hope to be in early April. Let me give a little bit of some background to the forum and our objectives, and you all can read much faster than I can talk. I'm not going to read through these slides, but one of the underpinnings of and goals for the forum is obviously to more optimally and effectively connect hundreds of technology companies and hundreds of investors. And this includes investors from the insurance and the reinsurance sector who have partnered with us and continue to join with us on this idea of pre-disaster and risk mitigated resilience. One of the challenges that we all have is that the opportunities are abundant, so are the resources, but we wanted to find a way to raise the bar on the relationship building across sectors, across public, private, philanthropic sectors, as well as a number of the investor types that are out there. We obviously want to adhere to that these are viable opportunities to invest in. We have set, using Wharton's at University of Pennsylvania, Wharton Center on Risk and Insurance, as well as our colleagues at the Insurance Information Institute, we've really chosen this 1 to 4 or better return on investment to drive the pre-disaster risk mitigated impacts. And so we're looking for and working on these immediate opportunities for achieving those types of returns. And last but not least is how is this ultimately going to change the risk model, whether it's climate related, other natural disasters, man-made disasters. How are we really going to change the model for improving and enhancing the strength of the economy, the industries, and especially the communities and citizens around us? Doesn't need to be said, doesn't need to be repeated, but I do want to raise the profile, Brad, of what you and I have talked about several times is that it used to be that maybe we had a flood here and a hurricane here and maybe a little ice and snow and something. Well, the reality is that 2021 is now I think it's the 5th or 6th year, Brad, that we've had multiple billion-dollar disasters, not just back to back, some of them literally on top of each other. And so not only have we had the overlay of COVID out there, but as many of you directly have experienced, we've had snow and ice, we've had fires, just a whole set of circumstances that now have added up to trillions of dollars of continuous losses, not for just the public and private insurers, not just for industry, but for individuals, our homes, our cars, our small businesses. So we know what the drivers are, from this, but there's also some new resource drivers that have emerged under the recently announced executive orders and reports and studies that the Biden administration have put out around resilience, the infrastructure bill that all of you have had a chance, I'm sure, to take a look at of how that breaks out across agencies and departments, and has built in several ways to measure performance of climate, sustainability, and resilience, especially around disasters. The insurance industry itself has been looking at this, along with the academic institutions across the country that do significant amount of research into both the economic and the societal impacts. And then frankly, we all have obviously needed to and have recognized that a lot of the disasters and the persistency of these disasters impact our neighbors and communities, especially in low to moderate income neighborhoods, harshly and in ways that are continuing to impact their ability to grow their families, participate in the economy. So it's not without the resources. We've identified, Brad, that there is obviously $1 trillion infrastructure bill. We've recognized that there are literally hundreds of millions of dollars of unspent presidential declaration dollars from previous disasters and events. The Reinsurance Association of America, in its testimony last July, announced that there will be $1.36 trillion of bond maturity that occurred in 2021 that needs to be invested in 2022. And then the $12 to $14 trillion of generational wealth that's moving, especially in areas of social impact and green infrastructure types of investments. So Brad, it's not without the resources either to do this. What I think is the challenge, and we are so looking forward to your observations and comments, especially from the vantage point of running your own company that deals with the Fortune 500 across not just the United States, but around the world, which I hope you'll talk a little bit about Green Gen. And in your most recent opportunity, and congratulations on your ascension to the role of a global board of trustees for a great organization called the Urban Land Institute. So Brad, with all of that as a lead up and kind of where we're going with the forum, which we'll again give a little bit more after your remarks and a chance to do a little going back and forth. I think, Brad, the stage is yours for sharing your insights, your perspective, but also, frankly, I hope that you'll put a challenge to all of us about where the investment lines are going and where the opportunities are. So, Brad, thank you so much for your friendship and especially for helping us kick off the inaugural forum.
Richard, thank you very much. And well, I'd much rather be in Houston. I'm glad that you're able to just sort of find a way to pivot and basically, take this, event and can make sure that it continues because the topic is so important. I want to take no more than half the time that we've got and talk a little bit, but I really want to make sure that we spend the rest of the time, Richard, either getting your questions or the questions that everybody's got, because what historically I find is that the people that are watching have as much knowledge, if not more knowledge and experience than we do. And so it's not one or two people talking, but it's that collaboration, that's the interaction that we all bring to it that I think is really dynamic. So I'll just spend a couple minutes really quickly talking about me and some observations and what I think has changed in the last couple of years. And I'll really just start by saying, my background is I come at this as an investor. I spent, the first 20, 25 years of my life in real estate private equity, started at JMB in Chicago when it was the largest real estate firm in North America, spent a decade at Starwood Capital as the founding partner of Starwood's international business in Asia and Europe. And that all really just informs that I think about the world in terms of return on investment. There's no amount of money that I wouldn't spend if I get a return. Put money out, get money back. It's a very simple world that I live in. And green generally grew out of that because up until 2008, real estate and private equity really just cared about one thing, and that was the top line. It was revenues, lease up, market. We didn't think about expenses. We didn't think about margin. And in 2008, that came crashing down very quickly with the financial crisis. And many of us rediscovered the bottom half of the income statement where the expenses lived. And so GreenGen was born in 2011, really to think about driving a financial outcome relative to energy and climate and insurance, but also do it in a way where it created co-benefits, not just a financial return, but also climate and resiliency and ESG returns. And for the first 10 years or so, we worked with people who basically wanted to drive that financial outcome with these other things. But there are two things that I think that have changed dramatically in the last couple of years that really sort of have caused this conversation to go from the back office, the back halls, if you will, to forums like this. I was speaking at a conference in September, focused on prop tech called Blueprint, but Blueprint was a parallel conference to InsurTech, and there were nearly 7,000 people in Las Vegas during COVID talking about insurance, talking about the built environment. And so I think that's really significant. So what's changed? One is regulation. Cities and governments primarily outside the United States, cities primarily in the US have become much more activist about demanding more from businesses, the built environment. And so they're raising concerns and they're raising requirements around carbon, energy efficiency, benchmarking, so there's public disclosure. That creates a much different world in which we live. And that's really in cities like New York, Washington, Boston, St. Louis, Denver most recently. We have a view that in the next 5 years, it's very simple. Every major MSA, the top 50 MSAs or more in the United States, will have some form of climate and or energy regulation. It is not if, it is simply a question of when. The other thing that's changed, and I think this becomes particularly interesting from a resiliency point of view, is the capital markets have really changed their tune. It is now really become, investors on the equity side. So limited partners for private funds, insurers, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds. You're not getting our money if you don't have an ESG and climate plan. And on the public side, the public shareholders have become much more activist about making decisions on who's doing well, whether it's Exxon and the resolutions that came from shareholders, the new board members, or if it's the ETFs, which are raising literally billions of dollars almost a day, it seems like, to align with sustainability. Those two things have changed dramatically. And with that, I think what has changed is really this idea that there's now a reason that we can quantify why one invests in resiliency. It used to be, no one wanted to do it. Cities and states, generally, public sector, generally doesn't do a good job reserving, if at all. They just end up, if there's a cost, if there's an emergency, if there's some sort of event, they just pay for it. They don't reserve the money like a private business or a real estate, mortgage. It comes along, they've got no choice, something breaks, power company, we've got to mobilize crews, we'll figure out how to pay for it later. And to some extent, I think those kinds of things, this idea of investing in resiliency was really borne out by PG&E in California.
Right.
They didn't invest in resiliency in their network. The ratepayers didn't want to pay. The public sector, the California board that approves rate increases, didn't want to do this. And the result was a lack of resiliency in the system. I live in Washington, D.C., so I'm in Bethesda, Maryland. Pepco has had the same issue. Pepco now is getting rate increases, is investing in resiliency. And recently, I live on a main street and all of our power lines are above ground. They came through with Asplin and they are just cutting and wiping out every tree branch that's anywhere near a power line and completely denuded our trees. And that is a crass form, but a very fundamental way of investing in resiliency. We will spend money now to make sure that these events do not take down our system. And with that, really has, I think, come this sort of expanded view of where return comes from. In the investment world, everything is about return. But the difference now is we start to recognize that there's actually an ROI associated with resiliency. Take the Port of Houston where Richard is sitting. So if the city doesn't invest in resiliency in particular because they don't want to bear the cost of putting resources in if there's some form of fuel leak in the bay, and it comes along, what happens? The ports are closed for several days. That means ships don't deliver, the fees are gone, people don't get paid. But now there's other things. Restaurants that are on the waterfront are closed. People who live on the waterfront, because of the poor air quality, now are more likely to go to the doctor, go to the hospital. There's more likely to see episodes of pediatric asthma or other pulmonary issues. People don't work. They don't get paid. They don't pay taxes. And so part of this idea of ROI around resiliency is much more to sort of create a system view, to think broadly about who benefits. Now, the challenge in some respects is if you do this right, nobody knows. It is boring. It looks like absolutely nothing. If you do it right, you're making these investments in advance. People are criticizing you. Why are you doing that? You're wasting your money. And then the events don't happen, or or the outcomes of the events don't happen. And people say, see, why did you spend that money to make all those changes? Because these things didn't happen. And that's the tricky part. But I think, increasingly with climate events increasing both in frequency and volatility, people recognizing you need to do this. And I'll give you perhaps, one other interesting example that we've been involved with. Ironically, the best macroeconomic story for real estate in the country today is South Florida. The number one on the negative side market for climate risk in the country is South Florida and Miami. And so you've got lots of major companies buying institutional quality, high quality real estate in South Florida and Miami, but they're not fully appreciating all the risks. And there are certain risks that we can't do much about. No matter where you are in Miami, you're exposed to the same hurricane risk, but you're not necessarily exposed to the same coastal flooding. Sea level rise to some extent, but the high tide, full moon incidents that happen, those can be invested in. And if you have an asset that's at 8 feet above sea level, you have one set of risks and probability from a value at risk point of view. But now if you invest in resiliency, you firm up the building envelope, you change the height of the penetrations, and now you're not an 8-foot from an actuarial basis, you're now a 12-foot asset. You're going to reduce the number of coastal flooding events by 2, 3, 4. Some won't have the same impact. Not only does that have the potential to save on cleanup, but also on insurance when you communicate that. But also there's an opportunity to communicate it to your stakeholders, to your tenants, to their employees, to their customers. And it makes your building more attractive on the margin than vis-a-vis others. Resiliency is tricky. There are certain risks you cannot expose, you cannot mitigate. You can make your shopping center really resilient by putting it on a hill. But if the whole area is flooded around it and people can't get to it because the roads are flooded out, you simply have an asset that's not flooded, but no one can get to it. So I think it's really sort of important to think about where return comes from, because our experience is that the insurance industry really only cares about 2 things: the probability of the event happening and the cost of the event should it happen. And investing in resiliency has the ability to impact both. You can reduce the probability of the event happening. You can take lots of water and aquifers or different water systems, and you can flow it down in advance of storm. You'll know a storm is coming in 3 days. You can flow water down to give yourself capacity and reserve upstream. But you can also then make investments in that if an event does happen, it will cost less by putting resources in place in advance to react quicker to mitigate some of the impacts. So I guess, Richard, I just want to make two more things, and then let's just sort of see where we take this.
Yep.
One is, so in my role as a global governing trustee of ULI, what I can say is that the built environment, developers, owners, investors, which make up the core of ULI, which is the world's largest member-based real estate organization, recognize today that these are real issues. The fastest growing part of ULI is its Center for Sustainability and Economic Performance, which has just been renamed in light of a very generous gift from Randall Lewis. But the interesting thing about that's talking about resiliency, healthy buildings, communities, ULI Greenprint, which is focused on data. And why is this the fastest growing part? It's the fastest growing part because people recognize that these types of investments, this type of deliberation, this type of systems thinking is profitable. Resiliency is profitable. Climate is profitable. But it takes a little bit of work to do it. Rich, I'm going to just want to close with one thing, and then you figure out where we want to go. So as Richard knows, and most of my friends don't know, before I went to college, I played soccer professionally in England with a team called Bristol Rovers, and I was a goalkeeper. And the interesting thing about a great goalkeeper, which was not me, but goalkeepers, if they do their job really well, they look really boring, because what you're doing is you're directing resources and your teammates way upfield. So before the ball gets down by you, you're making sure that people upfield are tracking back, that they're going to the ball, that they're putting pressure on. And if you do that right, almost nothing comes to your end of the field. Shots don't happen, they get blocked in advance. And it looks like you did nothing. And yet, at the end of 90 minutes, you're absolutely exhausted from mental pressure because you were directing all this. Resilience is the same thing. If you do resiliency really right, to some extent, nobody will know. Your kids will think you have the most boring job in the world because you basically kept events from happening. You kept outcomes from happening. And all the cataclysmic stuff that we read about, we don't read about anymore. But papers don't write a lot of, good time stories. They write mostly about bad things happening. They don't talk about how, Pepco cut down a lot of trees. And so, we have far fewer power outages than we used to. And this coming from a person whose house in the last 10 years has had 3 7-day power outages in Washington, D.C. So I'm very sensitive to that. So Richard, I'll stop there. And let's, sort of see where, you want to take it. Maybe we'll get some questions and dialogue going.
Well, I've got a page of notes. So whenever you and I have dinner, I think I'm the one who walks out with 5 pages of notes. You pay for dinner. I'm walking out with the notes. But Brad, let me start with something that you kind of began on and kind of came back to. And it's about this return on investment for resilience. I think something that you're raising is that there are a lot of pieces of the model for looking at a return on investment, even that go into a project that may not have a direct line to the hard dollars, but actually show offsets, show the secondary effects that are being captured, if I'm making sense. I mean, before we would look at a project and use of a technology and just go, okay, we're just trying to get from point A to point B, and that's how we're going to get our return and look at our margins. I think something that you're really emphasizing that we began to pick up a lot more last year is that there's all these other secondary benefits, these other some of them are offsets. If I spend money over here, it creates an offset over there. Talk a little bit more about as you describe these co-benefits and where returns come from. Am I making sense that?
Yeah. And I think, one of the challenges, real built environment has and city has is they have these disaggregated financial statements. And so there's a lot of different costs that are being impacted by, say, a single activity. They're all over the place. So I'll take just real estate for a moment. People they very much see the energy line, but the energy line typically has waste included in it, but it typically doesn't have repairs and maintenance. And
Right.
so if you've got older equipment that's using a lot of energy, one of the returns for investing and upgrading the building is you've got newer equipment that's under warranty that doesn't get subject to, off hours, service calls, non-negotiated upgrades when you need equipment, on the spot. And that's a challenge because that's usually owned by somebody else.
Right.
An example that we deal with is we often are installing solar film primarily as an energy conservation measure. We're installing it and putting it in place to reject the thermal load to reduce the HVAC cost. But at the same time, didn't know it initially, we learned that when you do that, you also reduce the probability of glass breakage. And that has an impact on the insurance. But the insurers generally don't drive around saying, oh, look, that building that we insure, they have solar film, we should give them a discount. So it's this, it's proactive. And insurance is almost certainly done by somebody else, not the building engineer,
Right.
not the person who's involved with equipment or energy. And so sometimes it requires sort of adding different components and different people and getting them to talk to each other. But I think, this is where the sort of notion of both stakeholders, but also an expanded view on return has been really important in the last couple of years to think more broadly about where return comes from. And using the example of Houston, not just thinking about the cost that the city has, but think about all the other costs that might be imposed on them that might actually tip the scales to make investing valuable.
I want to keep on going down this investment line, and then I'm going to bridge in the role of technology, equipment, and data science as both a contributor to that cost benefit, that return, as well as investable projects. I'm gonna take two examples you raised, add a third one in, all right? Because you raised Florida, all right? Building collapses in Florida last year, significant tragedy. And as you're aware, Brad, within literally 12 hours, Miami-Dade, Broward, and the rest of the counties sent inspectors out across the entire region and identified another 100 buildings that were what I would refer to as quite vulnerable due to deferred maintenance, of which that really is an issue. Then you got the PG&E fires out in California. And then you talked about Pepco cutting trees. I mean, this is the same issue when we talked with Alabama Power. This whole challenge of snow and ice. So I think what you're raising again is there are lots of regulations that could be in place, will be in place. I'm kind of in favor of how do we incentivize behavior? How do we incentivize companies, asset owners to actually be proactive? So take a look at, go a little bit deeper in your investment model of, okay, there's deferred maintenance, there's kicking the can down the road, whatever it is. Now there's this issue of either a regulatory compliance, but better yet, how do we look at incentivizing building owners, the design, engineering of these buildings, but also the building owners into these types of secondary and mutual benefits?
Well, it's interesting. And, California, for example, has identified seismic as a huge risk from a resiliency point of view. And one of the things they did is they basically took the PACE program, basically property assessed clean energy. So the PACE program is a way to finance using real estate tax sort of assessment to create the lien on the asset. But they used PACE essentially to provide a financing vehicle for seismic. And so what historically had been up to 10% LTV or loan to value for the asset now could go to 20, and it could be used for seismic. And the largest use for PACE in California is in fact for seismic upgrades. And
Wow.
so it wasn't so much that they, incentivized people per se, but they looked at the pain points. They looked at what was keeping sort of more take up and more upgrades from happening. And they created a program to, help address that. Florida, for example, and the Miami situation, which was just horrific in terms of the loss of life, as I understand it, the owners knew they needed to make investment. And there was a vote at the time ongoing, and there was discussion about whether or not to approve it. And a big part of that was how to pay for it.
Right.
And so, there are lots of, you have to look at sort of the pain points of why people don't do resiliency, whether it's a lack of forethought, whether it's a lack of sort of expanded thinking. And, perhaps, a way to address situations like seismic or other things, building collapses, will be to bring financing and basically bring, a business model to it. I mean,
Right.
in the energy world and the resiliency world, there's sort of two debates. There's, we don't have the right technology, and that, is somewhat epitomized in the energy side, is Bill Gates. We need better technology, breakthrough energy ventures. On the other side is, it's not technology, it's a business model. That's what I call the Jigger Shaw from Sun America, who's now running the Department of Energy loan program.
Yep.
And Jigger will say, we've got lots of great technologies. We just need the right business model. Most of the money that's been made in solar, that's a business model question.
I got to tell you, and both of us know Jigger, and I think he's right. I don't think it's an issue of technology. And again, I don't think it's an issue of capital, Brad. Frankly, there's a number of people on this call and who've been participating and will participate. There's a lot of smart brains around the world who can solve these from a technical, scientific, engineering application. I think he's right. And I think, you've been in the forefront of putting some of these together yourself, where it's the business model. How do you bring all of these pieces together? And sometimes it's not just a typical transaction. I got a buyer, I got a seller, it's complicated sometimes.
Well, listen, I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. The issue is not capital. The world is awash in capital that wants to invest in resiliency, that wants to invest in climate. But the problem is that people don't invest in ideas. They invest in projects. And, all these ideas have to then have a financial model that's created. They have to have a technology, they have to have labor costs. They've got to figure out all these pieces. Someone can say, I invest X, what's the source of repayment, and what's the why? And if you're, for instance, a city and you're going to float resiliency bonds, how do you repay them? And thinking as broadly as possible sort of about that. But I think, Richard, it's both. I mean, I don't think just business model will solve it, but I certainly don't think it's just technology.
Right.
The loan program that Jigger now runs is about basically creating ways to invest in technology, give them a business model, guarantee helping them, finance and get capital. And it's both. You need both. They're both really critical.
So let me go one step further, and I'm going to encourage those that are participating to use the chat or the Q&A, whichever one you want to throw in a comment and a question. This is intentional to be interactive. Let me talk about, let's talk about the capital markets that are evolving around these ESG goals, all right, and resilience goals. As you said, we now have the data science. We have the sensors, we got the Internet of Things, the tools, again, which are products of and opportunities here. It seems to be, Brad, that a couple of years ago, let's be kind of blunt, ESG goals were kind of made me feel good. It was a part of the corporate social responsibility page and all. And now it's kind of moved over to the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer. It's showing up in shareholder value. Talk a little bit about how you see it playing out over the next year or two, where it really moves deep into both the financial and the operating model for companies.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a couple examples. There's not a major investor in the world that it doesn't already have a head of sustainability or ESG, or is not in the course of searching for one.
Right.
I am very comfortable with that because that's who we work with. Every major city in the United States has a director of sustainability. Iowa, where we do some work, the former governor of Iowa, Chuck Culver, works with us. And we think of flooding as an example, as a coastal experience. Some of the worst flooding in the country is in Iowa.
Yep.
And today's report, the report that came out today on bridges, what's the #1 state in the country that has bridges that are basically rated, I think, D or better? It's Iowa, almost 2 times the next highest state. And in Iowa, there's over 200 cities out of 1,000 cities, 200 cities have a director of sustainability, because they know it's so important to their communities and to their stakeholders. Right. So, we're at a place now where people are no longer ignoring this. They're finding that it is so fundamental to their business. And so in the real estate world, we historically thought of, every relationship as being bilateral. I own a building, I have a tenant. The tenant is the person who signed the lease. That was it. But today, there's now more than 10 stakeholders. It's the person who signed the lease, it's their employees, it's their customers, it's their supply chain, up and down. It is the capital markets, it is their investors, if they're public, their limited partners, if they're private, it's their lenders on the debt capital side. It is the elected officials. If you need to pull a permit or you need something from the public sector, if you align with the community's values, you have a good chance of getting it pretty quickly. If you do not align with the community's values, you may never get it. And so it's this expanded view of the people who care, which is much different than it ever was before. And, you take it to the cities, again, it's just the expanded view of thinking about who cares, who benefits, who is penalized and bears the cost. And to some extent, investing in resiliency is simply time shifting. Cities will flood and you will have to replace things. The question is just whether do you invest money now to mitigate that in the future. From an actuarial point of view, it's going to be returned. Right. But you don't know when exactly. That's why we buy insurance, because we don't know if our house is going to get flooded or hit by lightning. It could be tomorrow, it could be in 50 years, but statistically speaking, it will happen at some point.
Well, that goes, wait a second, that goes to, this is the if-when proposition. We're going to reverse it, all right? Because you said earlier, it's, where the reinsurance world comes from is reduced probability and reduced loss claims, right? So reduced probability is if it happens. Reduced loss claims is when is it going to happen, right? And now with all of these back-to-back disasters, it's not a question of if it's going to happen, it's now when it's going to happen, right? And then you put on top of it what no one expected, which was a pandemic that changed the ability to go in and out of buildings, the use of the buildings. Something you said a second ago, Brad, these buildings are not just operating as if they're in their own silo. And that this is something that the Urban Land Institute has always worked on. And I think it's been one of the hallmarks of my knowing and working around Urban Land Institute, but you're there day in and day out, so to speak, and been a champion and leader within this advisory council. These buildings don't exist as silos. They exist within a community. There's impacts of consequences of what that building could do in a favorable way or potentially a negative way. All right. So I want to go back to this idea of incentivizing actions, whether it's because the financing makes it viable, or because there are these offsets, or it could be tax credits, whatever it is. But one of the things that we're finding, Brad, is that I am regulated to build a certain amount of detention retention ponds by the amount of concrete that I use, by the I take away the impervious land coverage, all right, and therefore I've got to offset it by building a pond. Most real estate, most landowners will take a position, I'm going to do exactly and no more. But what we're bumping into is a greater interest by the developers who are saying, why don't I build out a little bit bigger, a little bit deeper, or do something with my asset that benefits not just my quote unquote self-interest, but the larger community. Am I making sense? And are you seeing some of that?
Yeah, and again, I think it comes down to sort of, an individual view versus a systems view. And whether you think of that retention pond as an asset by itself or part of a greater ecosystem, and how does that, relate to, the other. So in DC, I chaired a technical advisory panel for ULI a couple of years ago in Union Market. And Union Market has sort of all sorts of groundwater, stormwater runoff issues. But there was no master developer, there was no PUD. There was a requirement in the city for 10% green space. And so you had essentially 17 different PUDs, 17 different tiny little pocket parks, because every individual project did it on its own. When what they should have done, organized by the city, was that they should have had a large park in the center that could have been an amenity, that could have been much more integrated into overall. But this is, again, the difference between a systems view and an asset view, which I think, creates a lot of challenge. So in your example, let's say you have a retention pond, you're downstream. Let's say there's 40 different retention ponds in an ecosystem in a watershed, and you're sort of lower down. Theoretically, that's an asset to everybody. So there's, the flooding that would occur upstream. Now, if somebody's worried, they can flow water 2 days before a weather event. They can flow into yours. You might keep it empty, and everybody pays you a little bit to have it available. And everybody maybe says, you know what, I'm going to basically take 10% of my water retention down. I'm going to flow it into Richard's really big pond. And I should pay Richard for that, because now I'm not flooding. It's not going to my garage. My insurance cost should be reduced, or I'm thinking about how I interplay with my deductible on my insurance. My tenants don't have business interruption claims. But the challenge is, how do you get all those different people to pay?
Well, we just got to, so one of our participants sent in the Q&A that, I don't want to get into, the challenges of partisan politics and all, but I think you're raising a great point, and that is, now how do you get this shared risk, shared value under that shared risk by bringing in all the spectrum of the stakeholders, the political interest, right? Because after a while, oh my God, Brad, I got to get this building up. I got all the kinds of other issues I got to deal with. But now you're telling me I got to go get 30 or 40 different stakeholders, right? So where do you see, is that the role of the chief resilience officer, the chief sustainability officer? Who really should be sitting at the table helping convene both the public and the private sector?
Well, that goes back to the question about who cares, and what we find is that the high, what you really want is, you want the most senior person in an organization. So in a city, the mayor; in a state, the governor; in the United States, the president; in Europe, the prime minister, the chancellor. If they don't care, it's hard to get everybody, below them to care. When we started engagement, the first thing we asked, whoever's head of sustainability resiliency is like, who do you report to? And some, there are some large public companies, they report into investor relations and corporate communications. Others report into, the CFO, the COO, the CEO. And that tells you everything about, how value is being considered. But it starts with the highest level person. And in the real estate world, there's something called GRESB, which is a rating system that a lot of investors use to assess funds and their ESG performance. And one of the fundamental questions in that is, who is the most, do you have an ESG or resiliency committee, and who's the most senior person that chairs it or runs it?
Yep.
Because they're really trying to get sort of at what level do you think about this? Now, the question that was asked in the chat, I think is really important, because the political question that we seem to be wrestling with in the US, not so much in other parts of the world, is what's causing the climate change. There doesn't seem to be a lot of dispute that the climate has changed. There only seem to be arguing about why. But if you're investing in resiliency, if you're investing in your buildings, why it's happening is a little bit secondary. I don't want to say it's not important, because it is important. But what you really need to understand is that it is happening. Storms are more volatile. There's not necessarily more.
They're intensifying faster. There's more of them. The concept, right?
Yeah. I mean, and for instance, let's say the rainwater doesn't change in a community, but instead of 20 storms a year of 1 inch, now you've got 10 storms of 2 inches. And so that impacts your infrastructure, your stormwater. It includes all sorts of other things. A lot of that water won't go into the water table because it's raining too quickly. So now it runs off. Where does it go? It takes the nutrients with it. It makes the land and the soil less valuable from a farming point of view. So there's a lot of things that are happening that we don't see in other situations that need to be considered.
So two questions. They're somewhat connected. I'm going to go with the first one, because I think it may lead to some insights on the second one. All right. Your initial comments included the necessity of the analysis of probabilities of the event occurring. Such probabilities are derived as children of scenario-based planning models. Yet I don't see investors and companies engaging, paying for, or utilizing such models and tools. What's your sense? I knowing a little bit about what you all do at Green Generation, you are looking at some of these scenarios for your customers and clients.
So, right? We do a lot of work with our investor clients, which are essentially the world's largest investors. Think the world's biggest private equity firms, the biggest real estate firms. And historically, when we did acquisition due diligence, it was energy only. Now we've added a big chunk of regulation, what's going on now, what's going on in the future. But the other thing that we're doing a lot of is climate risk, essentially what's the value at risk concept. And we're looking at basically and assessing quantitatively what's the theoretical value that's at risk from in any given year from 7 factors, including hurricanes, wind, sea level rise, coastal flooding, extreme temperatures, wind. And I missed one thing. And we're helping to think about which ones can you mitigate. And you go back to that South Florida example, hurricane. All of Miami has the same risk of hurricane.
Right.
All of Miami does not have the same risk of coastal flooding. And so you can invest in a way to mitigate that particular risk. We had one client as an example where we're doing this analysis to a lot of their new acquisitions. And what we suggest to them is, let's go back and give me the 10 assets that your board, that your investment committee thinks are iconic. These are like, the things you're most proud of. And we want to sort of help them understand the climate risk there. Like some will be in Lower Manhattan, or they'll be in Boston. And the risk of other cities like Charleston or Tampa, or perhaps other places, may not be any different than other assets. But we're trying to sort of, help them avoid sort of being blinded, sort of, having this inherent sort of bias on assets they already own versus one that they may not yet own. Because in many cases, they're taking on these same risks. So we do see investors increasingly thinking about the probability, or the children, in the probabilistic sort of modeling, world.
Hey, Brad, before I get to the other question here about insurance and insurance products, let me ask, just every once in a while I bump into this. If you're a publicly traded company, you are focused typically on shareholder value and quarterly statements. If you're privately held, you have a different perspective. Do you see that playing out where, the corporate model is yes, I'd love to think long-term. Yes, I'd love to think over the horizon, but I got shareholder value. I've got, quarterly milestones, versus again, kind of quote unquote, the private sector, which has a little bit more flexibility of how they want to see their scenarios and horizon. Is that old thinking now on my part?
Well, I think this goes back to this, my idea of sort of this expanded view, because, if you think it's only about shareholders, well, doesn't the fact that people do or don't want to work for your company impact shareholders? Doesn't the idea that people do or don't want to buy your product impact shareholders? And so I think it's simply a recognition of sort of, where the world is today. If you don't have if your company isn't thinking about some of these issues, people may not want to buy them. People may not want to work for your company. Right now we're in a situation around the world where it's really hard to attract talent. Right. One of the ways that you attract talent is having, a company that, aligns with your potential employees. If you're mostly focused on hiring, Gen Z 20-year-olds, then you need to be thinking about climate. If you're hiring mostly 50-year-olds, maybe you don't care as much.
Let me, this is now a public, piece of information, but, you're aware that I spent 5 years working for the president of MD Anderson Cancer Center. After Hurricane Harvey, the Cancer Center and the Texas Medical Center, like many places in the country that go through these types of disasters, they could not close the deal on their top 10 recruits who said, look, love to work at the institution. It's a great opportunity. We're not moving to Houston until we feel like it's safe enough for us to be there because of the flooding and such. So I do think you're spot on that people really have a choice. They have a decision to make where they are going to live, where they're going to grow their companies, where they're going to take their families.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk, as we're going to got about 5 more minutes, and then I'd like to spend a little bit of time rolling out what we're going to be doing for and with the investor forum over the next several weeks. Brad, from an insurance product, all right, you talked about, catastrophe bonds, resilience bonds. All right. What's your sense of how that aligns with these new types of insurance products that I refer to this as, when you and I call Geico up, they ask me, what kinds of technology do I have on my car? Anti-lock brakes, rear view camera, surround. And as a result of it, I get a discount. I sense that the opportunity to look at that from the property and casualty world is that, are there technologies that can be embedded that reduce losses? Right? What's your sense of how the insurance products are going to emerge here?
So I'll address that, and I want to try to sort of hit a couple of these questions really quickly. So we're an investor in a company called Conservation Labs, which is focused on acoustic sensors and machine learning to detect and mitigate water leaks. Their biggest channel partner, their biggest distribution, are insurance companies who are piloting it in their larger assets and are prepared to give it to the clients, to give them a credit for installing it, because they know if they give them, say, a $30,000 credit to install water and leak detection, that on an actuarial basis, they're going to basically, save $50,000 a year. So they, they look at that and say, we should do that all day long. Why wouldn't we do that? It's in our economic interest, because we're not mitigating the probability of the event happening, but they're mitigating the cost of the event because of fast and quicker detection, which means there's a lot less water damage. And there's a question just about Europe versus the US. And I think that's an interesting one, because, what we find is that, the action in Europe and Asia is at the national level. In Europe, there's an EU aspect to it, but also member state in the countries. In the US, a lot of the climate, action we're seeing actually is really not, at the federal level. It is at not in any case the state, it's the cities. In terms of environmental regulation, all the actions at the cities right now in the U.S. Right. Now you're seeing the Biden administration, you're seeing the federal government supporting state and local energy, regulation, but they're not driving it. They're just basically removing the impediments and, using EPA and perhaps other agencies, FEMA, to support, these actions.
Yep. So I think again, there's been this kind of system architecture, so to speak, of using the levers at the EU level and the country member country level. My sense is that you've got a number of mayors that are talking with each other. I think you're seeing regionalization, Brad, where you have multiple cities and multiple communities that are in the watershed or in whatever that zone is, where resilience is really necessary on not just this track or that city, but it's a whole. One other question that was in the chat, and I just want to make sure, is energy and brain space of these leaders has been impacted by the overlaying of disasters and the prolonged pressure they've been under. I see resilience of decision makers and resilience of built environment is linked. Is there any focus on the resiliency of the leaders, of the decision makers, of the, what's when you're together with your colleagues from ULI and talking with some of the elected and appointed officials that come to your tables? But I mean, they got to be exhausted. They're just going from event to event, disaster to disaster, whether we're going to open this building, whether we, how we use our money for responding or preparing for. What's your sense out there?
It is a significant part of the growth of ULI and lots of other organizations. The ULI meeting in DC a couple of years ago was the first time they had a basically Resilient Cities Summit. So they had people who are coming from all over the country, Norfolk, Virginia, Evanston, Steve Haggerty from Evanston, Illinois, but also you had people coming from like Shawnee, Kansas, and it wasn't specific to left or right, blue or red or purple. These were just simply leaders that recognized that these were issues that were impacting their communities, their stakeholders. And I think what's interesting is, increasingly you're seeing, the nature of elected officials changing. It used to be a lot of people that were lifelong sort of in the public sector, they rose up. Now you're seeing a lot of people come up from issues like, whether it's water, whether it's a Chesapeake Bay, whether it's fishing impacting their community, farming, and they're getting involved because they see these issues, impacting, having a negative impact on their communities, and they're looking for solutions to mitigate and stop that negative impact.
So Brad, one last question, and that is, let's talk about, because you have been an investor. You and I've talked about the leak detection. You raised it just a little bit ago. You've gone through the process of identifying a technology, investing in it, and then actually having to get out there and make sure it gets deployed. All right. So we have a number of technology folks that are on with us and are going to be listening, to the recorded version of this. What's your kind of one or two thoughts about being a founder of a technology company, really aggressively, got a great product, solid business plan, may even have some revenue. What's your sense of how to tackle all of what we've talked about today?
Well, listen, I think at the founder level, you see a lot of entrepreneurs sort of inventing something, but they're not clear on who wants it, why they want it, and how they want to buy it. And whether that's to buy a product or buy it as a service. I'm ultimately really encouraged, by, what I've seen in the last couple of years. I have a lot of friends who will say, Brad, you and Debbie are so smart to have started this company. What they sort of fail to recognize in the heightened, interest in ESG and resiliency is that we started this business in 2011. We began working on it in 2009. And we've been doing this a long time. And, if you go back, I'll just close with this. There was a lot of talk, in the last couple of years about Larry Fink from BlackRock and his letter talking about your point about return for shareholders versus other stakeholders. And, 2 years ago, when he got all this press associated with his letter, my reaction was the letter was almost identical in content to the letter he had written the year before. He hadn't changed. BlackRock hadn't changed.
Right.
We had changed.
Yeah, the environment
what
around
changed was we heard the message differently. Right. The message had been consistent, but now we were predisposed to listen to it and react to it differently because we were having different experiences. We were seeing different things in our community about how climate, weather, and other events were impacting us. And all of a sudden, it opened our eyes to a slightly different way to think about, things, thinking about it from a systems point of view, more holistically, where risk comes from and where return comes from. So I am very much an optimist in all this, recognizing that, it's not easy to be an optimist every single day. But I think it's the right place to be, and I think it's the one that will be rewarded, over time.
Brad, thank you for doing this. I'm going to make take two liberties of a request. One, if you can stick with us for just a little bit longer. I know you're swamped, and I know it's a Friday afternoon, but you're welcome to stick around as we go through the next steps. But the other is, somewhere in all of your busy schedule, I'd love to have you back into the forum as we get a little bit further along, and come back in on some levels around what we just talked about in regards to where and how technology founders, CEOs have got to really position themselves appropriately, maybe drill down a little bit deeper. So I'm going to beg for a liberty to invite you back and take a little bit more time as we go through the rest of the forum, if you would.
Yeah, and Richard, I would just say, I was really impressed with the questions that were coming in. I wish we'd had more time, but love to sort of see you figure out how to use technology to not just see the questions, but draw the people into the actual discussion on the screen.
Well, and
it can be done. You got to figure out how to do it.
Well, and boy, that is a perfect segue to discussing and sharing what we're going to have to do now in this. I just don't call it, Brad, the new reality anymore. All right. It is just, it's being in person is now the anomaly. But I want to share with all of you, and again, leverage what Brad has just shared. As you all have seen, and will now get more information about, we have taken a 2-day event that was back to back, literally from 7:45 to 8 o'clock, and begun to break it down into these modules. And we have over 32 speakers and panelists. We are actually finalizing a few of the roundtables and sessions, but we're pleased, and this will give you some sense of the folks that will be joining us and hopefully you over the next several weeks. From Kalandra Cruikshank in her work at Statebook, which is a phenomenal tool that measures exactly what Brad was talking about, and that is some of the economic and societal measures down to a very specific granular level. We'll be doing a fireside conversation with Howard Buffett and Howard's work at Columbia to come up with a new algorithm and a new way to take impact and traditional investing and bring them together to align the return on investment. So we have an opportunity to hear from them and engage with them. Our friend Raghuveer at Munich Re, who has taken on the North American role for sustainability and resilience, will be talking about not just his findings at Munich Re, but the work that he's been doing, especially in the past couple of months, of talking to regulators, elected and appointed officials, as well as other investors. And he's got some very specific suggestions and thoughts about where insurance and reinsurance align with other types of investment, family offices, and private equity. Our friend Scott Sikorsky from Fitch Ratings will join us. I've known Scott for a long time, and he is driving a significant initiative at Fitch about how projects are rated, including how they adopt innovative technology, equipment, and data science. So it's a mixture of not just the brick and mortar rating systems for big infrastructure, but how these designs for these projects incorporate new technology and new equipment. Our friend David Dodd, as a part of the Innovation Hub and his leadership of the International Sustainable Resilience Center, will bring together 4 or 5 leaders from around the country, around the world, that are driving the investment arms and driving the technology and innovation activities in their countries, because the intent of the forum is not just to look at the United States alone, but to see where we have opportunities with you and your technology products, your equipment, but also from the investors. Where do we connect investors into new opportunities, not just in our backyard? We look so much forward to Lars Powell at the Alabama Center on insurance and risk that has come from an industry background, leveraging his academic center to bring these partnerships together between insurance, technology, investors, and projects, and using data science to quantify and qualify those projects. This is just an example, and we're extremely pleased. It hadn't been easy to do this in less than 72 hours, but we're announcing the launch of the best we could do, and we're extremely pleased to be partnering with Hubelo, that has, I think, one of the better engagement platforms. It's not just your standard meeting, an event, it's not Eventbrite, it's not Zoom, but it brings all those pieces together. And as of an hour ago, the site went live. It will continue to be added to in the way of content, but we have launched the registration process. You all will be getting the link to the registration. You'll be getting a link to a way to leverage this very unique platform. And that platform includes the following. We will be doing these keynote speakers in panels. We'll be doing roundtables, but we'll also be doing breakout rooms. We have 4 breakout rooms planned. And those 4 breakout rooms, just, for not completely overwhelming you, but the 4 breakout rooms so far, each of them have a different theme, and each of them will convene senior leaderships from the different organizations, from the investor world, from the technology. They are fire, storm and flood, snow and ice, health and pandemics. We'll have 4 breakout rooms that will be in place over the course of the next several weeks. We'll have a lounge area set up so that after we do these different events, if some of y'all want to stick around and connect with each other visually, the best way we can do it at this point, instead of sitting around getting a coffee or a cocktail, to the best we can, we have set up some lounges for individuals to pull off and go sit and talk and connect, further connections. And then the last piece that's critical is that we have set up these one-on-one opportunities for investors and technology founders to sit in a private way and talk about their pitches, their, what they're trying to raise, how they're going to use those funds, the more traditional way that we would want a forum. We are going to do throughout the course of the forum our lightning rounds, which will continue, which are kind of fast pitch opportunities, and what we call innovation showcases. So what would look like an exhibitor area is not. It will be, we have 30 innovation showcase booths, to better phrase it, that we have set up for technology, equipment, data science, and other parties that are interested to showcase either their products, their solutions, their programs and activities. Those will have the ability for, obviously, your logos, your brands, your collateral marketing material, your videos, but also times for you to visit with people that are a part of the forum within your showcase. So to the best of our ability, we have now gotten a platform that will allow us to, minus the opportunity to be in person, which now will be more likely the 6th and 7th of April, to utilize this tool for engaging both during the events, but also between the events, because we feel like the forum should no longer be just a one-off type of event, but an ongoing series of engagements. We look forward to working with, example, Ira Ziff, who will be presenting about talent development, about executive search. He and I will talk about the 40,000 individuals that he's identified in the insurance and reinsurance world. So I look forward to not only having Ira present in a roundtable or fireside, but also for Ira to use one of the breakout rooms or sit with some of you around a lounge setting. That's the intent here. And it's pretty robust. Oddly enough, we're only using about 75% of the capacity. I'm sure that you all will have some thoughts on how to either improve upon it, or if you look at it and say, boy, I'd like to be able to use this part for my interest, please let us know. Again, this is an unusual approach, but to me, I think that this is the most efficient and effective in the absence both of an in-person, but also to make sure that we are doing what I said at the very beginning, optimizing more effectively ways to connect investors, end users, products and technologies. And so we're excited. You'll get the link in a little bit to start the registration and onboarding process. And I really appreciate all of you who have joined us today, and those who I know were not able to join us, but registered and are going to listen to the recording. Unless there's any other questions somebody wants to put in the chat or the Q&A, we're so excited to be able to use this. One other example is Alan Tratner in our national transition initiative around sustainability, climate, and resilience. We're going to leverage Alan and his network, some of the things that he's been doing, and to collaborate and partner on over 100,000 individuals that Alan connects with. Those are both investors and technology companies. So folks, lots of opportunity under the investor forum, and please leverage this and exploit it to its fullest. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your interest in helping us get the word out to your technology companies, the investors that you know. Let's go do it. Let's go make stuff happen. Have a great weekend. Please all stay safe and healthy. Thank you.